Chapter 31.
Zelda?
Link murmured, squeezing her hand now resting against his chest. Hylia's mythic gold had waned with the quiet fade of a falling star, but she still felt ethereal, lovely, stronger than he'd ever beheld, like a coil pressed back together in his palm, drawn and ready to spring back with kinetic vengeance. He caught his breath once again to make way for her own, the ebb and release of it, giving him the certainty that she was still here, the reassurance that he wasn't too late. She mumbled faintly into his suit, stirring awake from what felt like a dream. Just like all the dreams before it, slumbers of centuries, the robberies of her life and rule and love while the land's future was fought in her absence. 10,000 years, a blink of an eye, all ending with what seemed inevitable in the wake of this warmth.
Did I sleep?
She asked, still caught in the hazy between.
Maybe for a minute,
he said, taking the time to pry off his gloves and feel the radiance of her bare skin in his grasp, real and present and yielding to him in an electric undercurrent of want. He cradled her cheeks, pressing his lips to hers, savoring the cinch in his core when he caught the faintest moan exhaled down his throat from her own.
"You've been here,"
she said, the words rich and drowsy as she drew back, licking his taste from her lips, her forehead pressed against his temple. He could sense the gears in her mind whirring back to work through the fog, fitting together the broken fragments of secrets and artifice that had finally, blessedly burned.
"The Master Sword delivered, and then you. You Yiga bastard."
He seized her and squeezed as tightly as his arms could take, her bones straining against his chest. His second heart, just as vital as the one wired between his lungs. The girl, not the monarch, not the goddess, his Zelda, had survived. He had done nothing worthy of this miracle, nothing truly deserving of her. When was the last time he'd told her he loved her beyond the obligation of a greeting or farewell? It seemed impossible, the idea of putting this drive, this force that thrummed him forward, into words. How could he ever explain the endless slogging through blood and toil, the involuntary destiny that thrust the sword in his hand and weighted the dying hopes of strangers around his ankles? It only made sense with her. He kept grasping forward to the light he glimpsed in her eyes, the flicker from that first chance he'd beheld her at the Royal Knight Academy, where she was called Princess, with a sneer, the other recruits tossing insults between each other at the sight of her bowed head and heavy robes, unafraid of being overheard, echoing the giddy disdain packed up from their parents' kitchen tables. They used the ridicule as a salve when Link, the youngest of them all, lifted the Master's sword from its rest like an apple from a tree. Who cares? What a waste. Why all this effort, protecting a consort of nothing? He had watched her absorb the belittling doubt, absolutely aware of how thoroughly her worth was dismissed. She'd face the scrutiny of the recruits, or the townspeople, or the less optimistic sages to return to the only home she knew, and have the same sentiments echoed by her father, an all-encompassing, harmonized chorus of how her body, her mind, her essence were useless and defective. She couldn't span one sunrise to sunset without being reminded that she'd been born for one single purpose, a solitary aim that she could not, and likely would not, ever fulfill. And still she gathered strength that they couldn't see, an invisible amass of pain and defiance. But he'd felt it, long before he allowed himself to so much as dream of her touch. The beautiful, knotted, fractured heart that bitterly refused defeat. The fire of the hearth, a familiar, kindled home. The blade and title he was granted were a means to an end. The 6 paces of shadow he was permitted to walk in her wake. That sacred gulf they'd finally spanned to see each other and know, of course, it was you. The chasm they would always cross, building and scheming impossible ways back to one another.
"I know you're tired,"
his muted breath spoke into her ear.
"But we can't stay here. It's not safe."
She braced herself up, and the sight of the carcass slumping into the slaughter-soaked sheets sent her recoiling up off the bed in a burst of alarm. Her panicked hands brushed against her legs, as if trying to rid them of something sticky and stained. Ganondorf's olive skin was now the color of ash, and it would be easy to presume that he'd been festering in the chamber for a week. She stared down at the fallen Demon King, with an expression that he knew, without a doubt, he wasn't meant to understand. A cold retreating yoked in something like disappointment. He wanted to ask. He never wanted to know.
Riju's forces,
she realized, snapped out of her spell. She flew over to the armoire, frantically pulling the first robe that yielded from its hanger, the dragon-painted lotus silk from Cece.
Have they arrived yet? They haven't gotten through town, but it'll be any time now,
Link said, catching the slip of the sun from the sky as Zelda parted the curtain.
They'll pound Hyrule Castle Town back into rubble, if it stands any chance of slowing them down. Quick, grab the sword,
she said, tying the sash tightly around herself. Link stood up on the bed and yanked at the hilt, grimacing as the metal squelched through the severed muscle and crushed bone. Zelda's hand met his back shoulder.
And his head,
she added. He twisted toward her, arching a brow. Her eyes bored into the carnage, unflinching. If he wasn't poised above the cadaver, she would have hacked it off herself.
You'll need it,
she warned, sure to watch as Link raised the sword to the ceiling, letting the assuredness of blood forever stain her silk. The massive charging Gorons, Gerudo and Zoras, shaded by a swarm of flying Rito warriors, flew past the new castle town gates, abandoned by their usual Yiga sentinels. Bells rang out from the square and steeples, though in celebration or alarm, none of the residents were quite clear. Out of every second or third closed-off shop or brownstone, a man or woman emerged with their grandfather's old scabbard or the household's dusty hunting bow, slipping into the advancing makeshift battalion with cries of cries, "For the princess!" rallying them forward, loud and clear enough to catch the cowering ears behind the doors and curtains, the ones hedging their lots to cast at the victor. At the castle walls, Audrina stood in command as the Verena speared their arrows with bushels of fire fruit and hauled up their cache of bombs from the armory. This is where Zelda and Link found them, letting the onslaught inch slightly closer to the town center before the prized archer ordered fire. She was biting for her most spectacular strike, a fire show to ignite the square and turn the showcase Loftwing fountain to shrapnel. Perhaps she'd be lucky enough to knock Riju off her desert steed and straight into the ravaging flame. It would be more than enough to stoke the terror of the townspeople and their tinderbox of nerves, sending Hyrule's capital into a spiral of havoc and self-destruction.
Stand down,
Zelda ordered. Audrina whirled around with a start, still parsing her confusion when her voice rose once more.
As the Queen of Hyrule, I order you to stand down immediately. You're not supposed to be out of the tower. That was a direct order from the king, to all of us, she stammered, a gleam of true fear cutting across her narrowed green eyes. Your dear king is dead, Zelda pronounced, gesturing to Link, who held the gruesome tangle of red hair and dripping tendons like a pumpkin at the fair. Audrina lurched forward toward the knight, but Zelda launched her body into the cleft between them. A tremor of light pulsed from her palm, sending the warrior careening back toward her soldiers. As His Supreme Highness's wife and queen up to his last breath, this battle, and every one of you, are mine to command. Audrina's front teeth ground down on her lip, hard enough to ruffle her veil. And I order you, she reiterated, advancing on the last Verena commander left with Lena's cold body abandoned outside the royal chamber, blocking the door, to stand down and let them pass. Where is Lena? She insisted, strong enough to be insubordinate, but not enough to mask the quaver in her tone. Lena has been relieved of her responsibilities, Zelda said, strangely vicious, as if affecting an accent she'd only picked up immersed in this ferocious empire. Like black feathers and blood rubies. It didn't fit, harsh around the edges, dark and consuming against the specter of light. And you are now the last person in my knight's way. You can see how well that's worked out for the rest of his opposition. You traitorous, conniving bitch. I should kill you myself. Audrina spat while the rest of the Verena remained frozen at their labor, the air heady with confusion and terror. Zelda's lips puckered in a mock pout, mimicking a particular strain of gleeful cruelty with which she had become so intimately familiar. Do you think that's what your king would have wanted, Audrina? The promise of his heir snuffed out right along with me? Show some respect for his legacy. It's all any of you have left now.
The soldier took a sharp breath, puffing it through her nostrils.
That's a good girl,
Zelda chirped, and Audrina twitched with yearning to comment, a palpable note clawing in her throat that she swallowed back into the bile of her stomach.
Now all of your women are going to stand down and gather the rest of the castle forces. You will leave your arms at the gate and retreat to the sanctum. The advancing forces will be welcomed, and we will sort out all of you from within.
Audrina glanced from her king's grizzled remains to the ghost that beheld him, to the queen and her relentless force of will.
Vain! Lower your arms,
she finally shouted, her voice carrying down the length of the wall.
Stand down, all of you. Alert the stations. We've surrendered the castle.
Ripples and cries of shock, but an obedient step away from the walls as the Verena begrudgingly stuck by the honor of their orders.
Sanctum,
Zelda reminded her sharply.
Abandon your weapons.
Audrina clarified.
And meet in the sanctum.
Zelda was about to step after them, to survey operations as her supreme majesty, when Link's hand caught the crook of her elbow, leaving another stain on the ruined fabric.
Air?
He choked, the syllable a glass shard in his throat. She blinked, confused a moment before shaking her head, so accustomed all these months to only maneuvering in her own mind. Trusting another was a luxury she'd left in the cottage.
No, there is no. I'm not.
She glanced over her shoulder at the empty battlement.
There is no air,
she said clearly, punching each syllable, venting the truth.
There was only Ganondorf's wish for one, his ultimate, final wish for me, and the only reason he let my life continue as long as it did.
She breathed in deeply, suddenly unable to look at the disgusting heap in Link's arms as the nearness with which she'd skimmed the brink sank in.
It was an intention he decided to make clear to the entire kingdom, at the same moment he did with me. It was a blatant, deliberate lie that he parlayed from the ball's success to entrench himself further with the public. But the rumors only came out in the Gazette this morning. No one knows they aren't true yet, including his minions. So you're using his lies?
Link noted, much more hurtful than he intended, but somewhere between the armload of sinew and unfolding agonies, he'd lost his tact.
When they serve me,
she said, her voice rising up, an escalation that startled her.
Would you prefer I didn't? What else is going to serve you?
The question wasn't meant as unkind, only a plea, an entreatment to know what was coming before he collapsed from the weight of it. She flinched as if struck, then plunged forward after the guards in a wave of trailing fabric, leaving him no choice but to shadow. Riju and her cavalcade streamed into Hyrule Castle as easily as they had only a few nights prior, back when they were still the browbeaten guests of the now-fallen king. The sanctum was mostly filled with Verena casting weary eyes toward their Gerudo sisters, who peered back over their scimitars and spears, not sure when and how to breach the strange sum of grievances and time piled between them. Far less present were the Yiga brethren, many of whom had escaped and fled at the first quake of uncertainty from their commander. More still bolted out the gates hearing Audrina's edict, scattering for the respite of outskirt caves or the chasms still concealing their old hideouts.
The perimeter is secure,
Riju assured Link and Zelda at the observatory balcony as the three beheld the soft twinkling of Newcastle town below.
I understand you may not wish to stay here, Your Highness, and I can get you an escort and patrol for wherever you prefer to go. No, thank you, Riju,
Zelda said, leaning her elbows against the balcony. Link had sunk down to the floor, his bare back cooling on the stone. He'd been unburdened from the proof of death hours ago, when the Gerudo chief gingerly removed it from his wandering, stupefied custody. We'll, make sure this gets with the rest of him, she promised. He didn't have a change of clothes at the ready, but the Yiga uniform reeking of Ganondorf's innards was too much to bear.
We can't leave until everything is properly sorted,
Zelda insisted.
Is there somewhere within the grounds, then, that you would prefer to be?
Riju asked, searching both of her old, exhausted friends for an answer.
Is there anywhere here that makes you feel safer than another?
They considered a long moment before Zelda said,
"This might sound strange, but if it's possible to arrange, could we maybe be outside?"
She'd only meant for a few blankets to be brought out to the courtyard, some pillows rummaged from the closets or her old bedroom chamber, but none of their friends were having that. The Gerudo returned to their horses and packs to retrieve an airy tent that they erected over the bed that Yunobo and his Goron posse insisted they could effortlessly move from one of the nearby chambers. They were correct. 9 volunteers remained stationed at every window and entrance, sealing any possible or even theoretical point of egress. Close and relentless, but with their backs turned, deliberately out of earshot. Kindness upon kindness, infinitely more than she deserved. Link had stood there, right there, a few yards from where her pacifying tea tray was dropped in the afternoons. For all these months he was stationed closer than he'd been for many of the years they'd first known one another, while he was still trailing as her personal guard, devoted to his measures of propriety. The idea made Zelda self-conscious as she ran through all these months like flipping pages in a book, trying to decipher the story he saw. She sat on the edge of the makeshift bed, bone-weary but unable to close her eyes, lest the memories and shames spin around her like a carousel rollicking off its axis.
"Zelda."
Link's fingers brushed at her hip, begging her back.
"Come on. Please. Lay down. You're going to fall over." "I can't,"
she breathed, letting her face fall into her hands as her elbows dug into her knees. She wanted him to tear her backward, crack her open, discover all the festering rot inside. To see his face twist in revulsion with what he found there, to demand what she'd done and how she could have allowed all of this, to scrape out the moldering refuse with his nails and leave her, ended and hollowed. "I thought you were better than this," he'd say, because that was what he deserved. So much better than this, than her. But instead, she felt his weight shift on the other side of the mattress, rising up closer but resisting the closeness she knew he himself longed for, because he was good. Too good to believe that Ganondorf's prophecy could come to pass. There will be no agony for his mind to compare with seeing what you'll become.
"Zelda, I'm sorry."
His voice whispered in the dark, words she tried to pluck and grasp from the air but felt distant and incomprehensible. An apology intended for the woman he loved, not the horrid impostor she'd become.
"I never should have confronted you about Ganondorf's lies. Especially in the middle of securing the castle, when you'd barely had time to breathe, let alone explain anything you've been through. Not that you owe me any kind of explanation about what you've been through. I was stupid and callous, but I just panicked. It was like the ground caved in and the sky came down all at once, and I was sure. I'm too late. I left her in his hands for a year, and I'm too late. There were 100 chances I had to stab him like you did, and I didn't take the shot. Not once."
He swallowed hard enough for her to hear the jagged sound.
"I just stood there, right there, and let you suffer." "And what would you have done after taking the shot?"
She craned her neck around, resting her chin against her shoulder, her face a silvery profile in the moonlight.
"If the gods were merciful, you would have maybe one lucky stab with your clan-issued blade, giving away your presence. My power was trapped. There would have been nothing I could do to help you, save for screaming from the sidelines some tips on running for your life. When the chance came to end this, you took it, just as I asked of you. But if I'd have been as careful as I promised, I wouldn't have had that chance,"
he argued.
"It was a rash decision. Riju was so convinced we could pummel the castle together, and seeing you at the ball, catching you." "Catching me,"
she murmured, a mystery she answered with each unfolding syllable. "The Yiga when I fell." The memory clenched around her heart, a visceral pang that sent her clasping for her chest. It was him who had been there when the news of their home had been too much to bear. How had she not known it was him? How had she missed that grip, the taut masculine grace, his innate sense that she needed his strength before she could think to ask?
"It went against what I vowed to do, and I could have gotten you killed. Your instincts were right,"
she argued.
"Ganondorf was distracted and the castle had gone slack. Riju had enough freedom and leverage to make a surprise strike. I was too valuable of an asset, you must have known, to be in immediate danger. You found exactly what I'd hoped you would. Then what's keeping you from even trying to rest? Because, Link, you are too late.
Her voice cracked, and she grasped the blanket beneath her, twisting it tight.
It was too late as soon as I swore fealty, and watched Sidon die, and did nothing but bow and concede. And that night, in the lockup, when I chose life above over imprisonment below, because I was so desperate, and yes, I was scared.
Her breaths quickened as the narrative came down in avalanche, all of her shaking in its tremors.
And I can say that I had no choice, but Link, I chose everything.
Her words were short, quick hiccups of air cutting off the words as she forced them free, garbled and croaked.
I could have fought or denied him, or found another bargain. I could have held out at arm's length, but I didn't. I didn't find him unbearable, not as I should have, not as a good person would have. And now, I feel as if I know things, deplorable things about who I am and what I'll do, and I don't mean what I'll endure, but what I'll enjoy. So much, and I can't.
She inhaled suddenly, clutching at the ugliness she felt protruding from between her ribs, as real and devastating as the sword she'd driven into that place her palms would find, racing against cresting pleasure.
I can't stuff that back away where he found it. I know what was uncovered, and now it's real, and it's part of me, and I can't get it out of me. I will never get it out of me.
She wrung her hands, laden with lusciously coaxed ecstasy and the taste of leather and dirt. What she couldn't forget, and knew, she didn't want to. The night overcame the silence, the paddling of the moat's water and the crickets rejoicing in the grass. It was Link who finally spoke.
Did you love him? No,
she said vehemently, shaking her head. Then, hugging herself fiercely, she went on.
But in another life, in some other world, maybe I could have. And that terrifies me.
She heard him sigh, heard the scrape of hand on scalp as he ran his fingers up and through. Her instincts bucked inside, crying out at her to smooth all of what she'd said away, blame the crushing fatigue and stress, to tell Link how overjoyed she was to see him, and that nothing would ever come between them again. She needed him. She came apart without him. She'd make up the world to him. But instead, she held fast to her sides, letting the force of the truth settle into their bodies, truths she couldn't conceal from him. The only agony she could conceive worse than this was the one in which she spent the rest of her life varnishing the truth, clinging to the tricks she'd honed beneath the Demon King. It was tough to catch Link's voice as it rose once again, quiet and clipped, but even.
I didn't have to kill Lena,
he sorted aloud.
Her partner had already fled for help when they heard all the screams from just underneath the tower. The hallway was empty at that point. I could have knocked her unconscious, or locked her up in another chamber. I could have done pretty much anything but stab her with her own spear 7 times.
His eyes wandered out to the moat, and all of its choppy fractals mirroring starlight.
I could have been stealthy and made it up the east wing without running my sword through any of the other guards. It might have taken me a few more minutes, but the castle was already plunging into chaos. No one would have noticed, or stopped if they did. Laying waste to everyone on the way up to find you? It was lazy. But I didn't do it because I was lazy. It's because I wanted them dead. Killing them myself was the only way to make sure they were.
Zelda turned, drawing her knees back up on the bed, her mouth dropping slightly as she beheld the knight's confession.
And I didn't need to stake out a whole Yiga patrol to get a uniform and name. I could have found someone solo, or just chased down a deserter. There wasn't a day that went by without one of them running for the hills or the depths, sick of bad sleep and worse food. Or I could have waited for one of them to pass out drunk at an inn or stable and robbed him blind. But I had a good excuse to hunt and finish them, so I did. Any chance I had. Each and every one of these bastards. I didn't just want them dead. I wanted to see them die.
He grappled forward, clamping down on her hand.
We don't get to pick how we're going to react when everything we know is ripped away from us. Zelda, I know you want to plot out every twist and strategy and stay 10 steps ahead of every scenario. And thank goddess you do, but you can't be certain what your body and your mind and your heart are going to need when you're fighting with every single breath.
He turned her palm up, his thumb tracing the spot where the light pulsed through.
How stupid would I have been for stabbing that demon on the patio? How do you think he'd take you refusing to bend the knee? How long would Hyrule have survived that, do you think? He dredged up not one but 2 military factions because he wanted to take everything you had and everything you were. Hell, he came back from the dead for it.
In her surprise he scooted forward, tipping his head down, his dirty blonde hair casting sharp, digging shadows across his perfect face.
You didn't want to spend a year in the lockup? The academy trained us to withstand interrogation and torture, and I would have been lucky to make it a week down there before I cracked. You did exactly what you asked of me. You were patient and careful until you finally had a shot. And until you did, you found something glorious inside of you that kept you going insane. That wasn't him. That was you.
He reached up, tucking the hair behind her ear, letting the tears dam against his thumb.
The heroes we hear about in all these legends, the stories they lived long enough to tell, those don't come from people that are perfect. They're from the ones that survived. And Zelda, by some goddamn unbelievable miracle, again, you made it back.
She catapulted herself against his chest, heaving the racking, wretched sobs straight into his skin, relishing the squeeze as he caught her, just as he always did, late or fumbling, lost or strained, but ever found.
I missed you,
she grieved, his nose pressed against the crown of her head, lips meeting her hairline part, and when every last cry was exhumed, leaving only empty gasps of air, she remained in the crook of his embrace, his gentle stroke of her hair as natural as a heartbeat, the peace of his breaths as she drowsily counted, up and down, 1 and 2, had her nearly lulled to sleep when he murmured just above her ear, faint enough to be a spectre from a dream.
And whenever, if ever, you like, you should show me what you found.
He kissed her brow.
Nothing you are can scare me.
End of chapter.